Listening Practice Part 3 The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers Economic Change and Military Conflict from 1500 to 2000 by Paul Kennedy. We'll read this book, and there are different chapters about this book, and we'll read these chapters one by one into different clips. So let's start with the first one. The very first chapter is about strategy and economics in the pre-industrial world, and then the rise of the Western world. In the year 1500, the date chosen by numerous scholars to mark the divide between modern and pre-modern times, it was by no means obvious to the inhabitants of Europe that their continent was poised to dominate much of the rest of the earth, the knowledge of which contemporaries possessed about the great civilization of the Orient was fragmentary and all too often erroneous. Based on it was upon travelers' tales which had lost nothing in their retelling. Nevertheless, the widely held image of extensive Eastern empires possessing fabulous wealth and vast armies was a reasonably accurate one, and on first acquaintance those societies must have seemed far more favorably endowed than the peoples and states of Western Europe. Indeed, placed alongside these other great centers of cultural and economic activity, Europe's relative weaknesses were more apparent than its strengths. It was, for a start, neither the most fertile nor the most populous area in the world. India and China took pride of place in each respect. Geopolitically, the continent of Europe was in awkward shape, bounded by ice and water to the north and west, being open to frequent landward invasion from the east and vulnerable to strategic circumvention in the south. In 1500 and for a long time before and after that, these were non-abstract considerations. It was only 8 years earlier than that Grenada, the last Muslim region of Spain, had succumbed to the armies of Ferdinand and Isabella, but that signified the end of a regional campaign, not of the far larger struggle between Christendom and the forces of the Prophet. Over much of the Western world, there still hung the shock of the fall of the Constantinople in 1453, an event which seemed the more pregnant because it by no means marked the limits of the Ottoman Turks' advance. By the end of this century, they had taken Greece and the Ionian island, Bosnia, Albania, and much of the rest of the Balkans, and worse was to come in the 1520s when their formidable Janissary armies pressed towards Budapest and Vienna. In the south, where Ottoman galleys raided Italian ports, the popes were coming to fear that Rome's fate would soon match that of Constantinople. Whereas these threats seemed part of the coherent grand strategy directed by Sultan Mehmed II and his successors, the response of the European was disjointed and sporadic. Unlike the Ottoman and Chinese empires, unlike the rule which the Mongols were soon to establish in India, there never was a united Europe in which all parts acknowledged one secular or religious leader. Instead, Europe was a hodgepodge of petty kingdoms and principalities, marchers, lordships, and city-states. Some more powerful monarchies were arising in the West, notably Spain, France, and England, but none was to be free of internal tensions, and all regarded the others as rivals rather than allies in the struggle against Islam. Nor could it be said that Europe had pronounced advantages in the realm of culture, mathematics, engineering, or navigational and other technologies when compared with the great civilizations of Asia. considerable part of the European cultural and scientific heritage was, in any case, borrowed from Islam, just as Muslim societies had borrowed for centuries from China through the media of mutual trade, conquest, and settlement. In retrospect, one can see that Europe was accelerating both commercially and technologically by the late 15th century, but perhaps the fairest general comment would be that each of the great centers of the world civilization about that time was at a roughly similar stage of development, some more advanced in one area but less so in others. Technologically and therefore militarily, the Ottoman Empire, China under the Ming dynasty, a little later northern India under the Mongols, and the European state system with its Muscovite offshoot were all far superior to the scattered societies of Africa, America, and Oceania. While this does imply that Europe in 1500 was one of the most important cultural power centers, it was not at all obvious that it would one day emerge at the very top. Before investigating the causes of its rise, therefore, it is necessary to examine the strengths and the weaknesses of the other contenders. Ming China. Of all the civilizations of pre-modern times, none appeared more advanced, none felt more superior than that of China. Its considerable population, 100 to 130 million, compared with Europe's 50 to 55 million in the 15th century, its remarkable culture, its succeeding fertile and irrigated plains, linked by a splendid canal system since the 11th century, and its unified hierarchic administration run by a well-educated Confucius bureaucracy had given a coherence and sophistication to Chinese society which was the envy of foreign visitors. True that civilization had been subjected to severe disruption from the Mongol hordes and to domination after the invasion of Kublai Khan, but China had a habit of changing its conquerors much more than it was changed by them, and when the Ming dynasty emerged in 1368 to reunite the empire and finally defeat the Mongols, much of the old order and learning remained. To readers brought up to respect Western science, the most striking feature of Chinese civilization must be its technological precocity. Huge libraries existed from early on. Printing by movable type had already appeared in 11th century China, and soon large number of books were in existence. Trade and industry, stimulated by the canal building and population pressures, were equally sophisticated. Chinese cities were much larger than their equivalents in medieval Europe, and Chinese trade routes as extensive. Paper money had earlier expedited the flow of commerce and the growth of markets. By the later decades of the 11th century, there existed an enormous iron industry in North China, producing around 125,000 tons per annum, chiefly for military and governmental use. The army of over 1 million men was, for example, an enormous market for iron goods. It is worth remarking that this production figure was far larger than the British iron output in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. 7 centuries later, the Chinese were also probably the first to invent true gunpowder, and cannons were used by the Ming to overthrow their Mongol rulers in the late 14th century. Given this evidence of cultural and technological advance, it is also not surprising to learn that the Chinese had turned to overseas exploration and trade. The magnetic compass was another Chinese invention. Some of these junks were as large as later Spanish galleons, and commerce with the Indies and the Pacific Island was potentially as profitable as that along the caravan routes. Naval warfare had been conducted on the Yangtze many decades earlier. In order to subdue the vessels of Sung China in the 1260s, Kublai Khan had been compelled to build his own great fleet of fighting ships. equipped with projectile throwing machines, and the coastal grain trade was booming in the early 14th century. In 1420, the Ming Navy was recorded as possessing 1,350 combat vessels, including 400 large floating fortresses and 250 ships designed for long-range cruising. Such a force eclipsed but did not include the many privately managed vessels which were already trading with Korea, Japan, South Asia, and even East Africa by that time, and bringing revenue to the Chinese state, which sought to tax this maritime commerce. The most famous of the official overseas expeditions were the 7 long-distance cruises undertaken by the Admiral Shen Ho between 1405 and 1433, consisting on occasions of hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men. These fleets visited ports from Malacca and Ceylon to the Red Sea entrances and Zanzibar, bestowing gifts upon differential local rulers on the one hand. They compelled the recalcitrant to acknowledge packing on the other. One ship returned with giraffes from East Africa to entertain the Chinese emperor, another with a Ceylonese chief who had been unwise enough not to acknowledge the supremacy of the Son of Heaven. It must be noted, however, that the Chinese apparently never plundered nor murdered, unlike the Portuguese, Dutch, and other European invaders of the Indian Ocean. What historian and archaeologists can tell us of the size, power, and seaworthiness of Shen Ho's navy? Some of the great treasure ships appeared to have around 400 feet long and displaced over 1,500 tons. They might well have been able to sail around Africa and discover Portugal several decades before Henry the Navigator's expeditions began earnestly to push south of Ceuta. But the Chinese expedition of 1433 was the last of the line, and 3 years later an imperial edict banned the construction of sea-going ships. Later still, a specific order forbade the existence of ships with more than 2 masts. Naval personnel would henceforth be employed on smaller vessels on the Grand Canal. Shen Ho's great warships were laid up and rotted away. Despite all the opportunities which beckoned overseas, China had decided to turn its back on the world. There was, to be sure, a plausible strategical reason for this decision. The northern frontiers of the empire were again under some pressure from the Mongols, and it may have seemed prudent to concentrate military resources in this more vulnerable area. Under such circumstances, a large navy was an expensive luxury, and in any case, the attempted Chinese expansion southward into Annam, that is Vietnam, was proving fruitless and costly. Yet this quite valid reasoning does not appear to have been reconsidered when the disadvantages of naval retrenchment later became clear. Within a century or so, the Chinese coastline and even cities on the Yangtze were being attacked by Japanese pirates, but there was no serious rebuilding of an imperial navy. Even the repeated appearance of Portuguese vessels off the China coast did not force a reassessment. Defense on land was all that was required. The Mandarins reasoned for had not all maritime trade by Chinese subjects been forbiddable in any case. Apart from the cost and other disincentives involved, therefore, a key element in China's retreat was the sheer conservatism of the Confucian bureaucracy, a conservatism heightened in the Ming period by resentment at the changes earlier forced upon them by the Mongols. In this restoration atmosphere, the all-important officialdom was concerned to preserve and recapture the past, not to create a brighter future based upon overseas expansion and commerce. According to the Confucian code, warfare itself was a deplorable activity, and armed forces were made necessary only by the fear of barbarian attacks or internal revolts. The Mandarins dislike of the army and the navy was accompanied by a suspicion of the trader, the accumulation of the private capital, the practice of buying cheap and selling dear, the ostentation of the Noviyarishi merchant, all offended the elite scholarly bureaucrats almost as much as they aroused the resentment of the toiling masses. While not wishing to bring the entire market economy to a halt, the mandarins often intervened against individual merchants by confiscating their property or banning their business. Foreign trade by Chinese subjects must have seemed even more dubious to Mandarin eyes simply because it was less under their control. This dislike of commerce and private capital does not conflict with the enormous technological achievements mentioned above. The Ming rebuilding of the Great Wall of China and the development of the canal system, the iron works, and the imperial navy were for state purposes because the bureaucracy had advised the emperor that they were necessary. But just as these enterprises could be started, so also could they be neglected. The canals were permitted to decay. The army was periodically starved of new equipment. The astronomical clocks built 1090 were disregarded. The ironworks gradually fell into desuetude. These were not the only disincentives to economic growth. Printing was restricted to scholarly works and not employed for the widespread dissemination of practical knowledge, much less for social criticism. The use of paper currency was discontinued. Chinese cities were never allowed the autonomy of those in the West. There were no Chinese burghers with all that term applied. When the location of the emperor's court was altered, the capital city had to move as well. Yet without official encouragement, merchants and other entrepreneurs could not thrive, and even those who did acquire wealth tended to spend it on land and education rather than investing in proto-industrial development. Similarly, the banning of overseas trade and fishing took away another potential stimulus to sustain the economical expansion. Such foreign trade as did occur with the Portuguese and Dutch in the following centuries was in luxury goods, and although there were doubtless many invasions controlled by officials, in consequence, Ming China was a much less vigorous enterprising land than it had been under the Song dynasty 4 centuries earlier. There were improved agricultural techniques in the Ming period, to be sure, but after a while, even this more intensive farming and the use of marginal lands found it harder to keep pace with the burgeoning population, and the latter was only to be checked by those Malthusian instruments of plague, floods, and war, all of which were very difficult to handle. Even the replacement of the Ming by the more vigorous Mancus after 1644 could not halt the steady relative decline. One final detail can summarize this tale. In 1736, just as Abraham Darby's ironworks at Colebrook Dale were beginning to boom, the blast furnaces and coke ovens of Honan and Hopei were abandoned entirely. They had been great before the conqueror had landed at Hastings. Now they would not resume production until the 20th